Anyway, so yeah, I'm going to talk about the peaceful revolution. What a great thing to be able to talk about. I've always wanted a revolution. As Agitate said, I was very involved in left-wing politics. I mean, I was a child of the 60s and the 70s. So, we wanted a revolution. That was what we did. I could sing for you, but I won't about wanting a revolution. But I was never a hippie. I'd just like to say I was never a hippie. People think everybody that set up Shunyata or got involved in its first 10 years were all hippies. I was not a hippie. Hippie dippies were just too laid back for me. I was a bit more aggressive than that. But anyway, that will come out more in the talk. But so yeah, as I'm going to talk about a couple of revolutionaries. And later on in the talk, I want to share with you a couple of revolutionaries that have been very inspiring to me. So one of them is Dr. Ambedkar, who I imagine most of you will know about. I'll say more about him when I get there. And the other one might seem like an unlikely revolutionary, and that's Sangharakshita. But in my mind, he was a revolutionary, and I'll tell you when I get there as to why I think that. But first I thought I'd say a little bit about my own experience. So picking up a little bit on what Agitate said. I wanted to change the world. I mean, that was the bottom line for me. I could see that the world was unjust, that there was poverty. Well, I grew up in quite a poor household and quite a poor part of Glasgow. Not very far at all from where I'm sitting now, but and, my background was a strange combination of Catholic and communist, because the two influential figures in my life were my father and my maternal grandmother, who were very close, actually. They were good. We lived with my maternal grandparents. And my father was a member of the Communist Party. And one of the things that he did, which had quite an influence on me, actually, was he was the Scottish editor of the Esperanto Times. So if you don't, some of you younger persons might not know about Esperanto. It was a kind of made up language, made up of different European languages. And the idea behind Esperanto, as I understood it, was if everybody spoke the same language, you wouldn't get conflicts because people would understand each other. So beautifully idealistic. Anyway, so that was, and my granny, on the other hand, was a good, devout Catholic. But she was probably, although she would never have heard this term or never have thought of herself in those terms, she would probably have loved liberation theology, because she definitely felt that being a Catholic had a social responsibility. It wasn't a personal practice, it had social responsibility. So that they were two of the strong influences in me growing up. And I definitely was looking for ways to change the world. So I had a good go at politics. I started in the Young Communist League when I was about 12. And then I moved slightly further left as time went on. And you have to remember, this was before Hungary. Well, it was after Hungary, but it was when communism still felt like it might be a positive force. Anyway, what I found quite difficult about my political experience was a number of things. One of them was the people. So there was these beautiful ideas and ideals, and yet the people that were practicing it, or the people that called themselves Marxist or communist or socialist of a particular type of socialism, were actually very misogynistic and quite homophobic. So it was not a pleasant environment, really. And that was one of the things that I found really disillusioned me. So I gave a good go at sex and drugs and rock and roll as well, because I thought, well, maybe that's where the answer to the world's problems lay. So 1977, I'm 25. I won't go into all the things that happened in that year, but a number of things happened which made me realise that I was not going to find the answers to the questions that I was asking in either politics or in sex and drugs and rock and roll. So I stumbled upon Buddhism at this point. But before I go into talking about that, when I look back at myself in that era, I was a very, very angry young woman. I was angry for a number of reasons. Some of them were social. They were to do with things that I could see that I could, that weren't right. But also there was stuff from my own trauma from my own childhood, which I think had led to anger. And rather than recognising that as a psychological issue to work with, I think I just projected it all outwards and just saw the world as quite a hostile place that needed to be sorted out. So I was quite an angry young woman who harangued people, for the sake of peace. So, I could stand outside the Bank of England. I remember going down to London on one occasion on a bus with some friends, and we stood outside the Bank of England shouting at people for being capitalist pigs or whatever. And I remember having a conversation about world peace and the need for world peace at a very high decibel level. So when I look back, I can see that I was probably, to some extent, part of the problem rather than part of the solution. Not in a cosmic or global way, but in a personal way. I did not create a peaceful environment around me. So I recognised there was violence in myself. So that was one of the things I wanted to work with. So I stumbled upon Buddhism. I needed to change my life. That was in my mind. I need to change my life. And I saw a poster that said, change your life. So I thought, okay, that sounds like something to pursue. And it was the Glasgow Buddhist Centre, which in those days was the Friends of the Western Buddhist Order. And they had I saw a poster which said, Buddhism for today and tomorrow. I thought, okay, that sounds interesting. So I'd already explored Buddhism a bit as a kind of philosophy, but I'd never really thought of it as a practice in a way. So I rung up the phone number and they invited me up the very same night, and I went off and I heard this talk by Sangharakshita. And it was a talk he'd given the year before, 1976, 4 talks that he'd given in Brighton called Buddhism for Today and Tomorrow, which are in a little booklet now, actually, and they're fantastic talks, highly recommended. But the thing was, his voice put me to sleep. So I had this weird experience, slightly schizophrenic, slightly kind of, divided experience of getting really stimulated by the content and kind of almost dropping off, listening to this English kind of very slow, ponderous sort of voice. But what he said, well, it convinced me really, because he was talking about how you can't change the world without changing yourself, basically. It was a talk called The Nucleus of a New Society. And no, nucleus, yeah. No, it's a blueprint for a new society, nucleus for a new society. Anyway, it was one of those talks, nucleus of a new society, and it was about the need to change oneself before you can actually change the world. So that made a lot of sense to me, and I thought, okay, I'll give this a go. So one of the things that I loved about Buddhism very quickly, because I'm the sort of person that throws himself into things. So that very night, I remember saying to Damarati, who was one of the order members there, okay, give me something to read. And he gave me the 3 Jewels of Buddhism, which is one of Sangharakshita's more dense works in a way. I don't mean dense as in stupid, I mean dense as in quite compact. So I took it home and I read it in 2 nights, and I wrote off to Sangharakshita with a load of questions. Which he was very pleased about, because he said he didn't think people read his books much, and when they did, they didn't really ask him questions. I'd studied philosophy, so I kind of got back to him with all these very deep questions, which he very kindly took the time to answer. But anyway, what I was really taken by was that there was a path you could follow. There was method as well as theory. There was praxis as well as theory. So having come from a kind of background of theoretical analysis of society, but with nothing to do, in a way, there was nothing in that analysis that said, act like this or do that. This was incredibly refreshing. And one of the first teachings that I came across, which I found extraordinary was the Threefold Path. Really basic, but my goodness, it really sort of changed my life. It really opened my eyes to things. And so the Threefold Path of ethics, meditation, and wisdom, I believe, and my thesis for the rest of this talk is that they are the basis for the peaceful revolution. That they are the values needed if we want to be revolutionaries. Okay, so I'm going to say a little bit about each of them and then I'll move on. So meditation, I had no interest whatsoever in meditation. I was dragged to my first meditation class by Dhammarathi, who I've mentioned before. I was only interested in really the kind of, I wanted to have deep discussions. I think I terrified the guys that ran the Buddhist Centre actually, because at the end of the first talk, I had all these questions and I'd come from this very analytic, fairly aggressive background. I think they were all a bit like, oh my God, what is this? Anyway, they were very kind to me and they answered all my questions. Dhammarathi talked to me till 3 a.m, which was very Glaswegian of him. And, he said at some point, look, if you're really serious about this Buddhism lark, you have to learn to meditate. And I thought, really? Oh, well. So I kind of thought I was dragged alone to my first meditation class. And I can't say to you I took to it like a duck to water, because actually I struggled with meditation for a long time. It didn't come that easily, but I very quickly could see why you needed it, because the two practices that we teach and that I was taught immediately, like over the first 2 weeks of going, were awareness and mindfulness in the one hand and metta in the other. And quite soon after I got involved, people from the Glasgow Centre went to a kind of, it was a festival of something or another. It was really strange. It was a whole mixture of religious people and socialists and a weird sort of combination. And we had a stall for the FWBO that had a big banner above it that said, awareness is revolutionary, which was an aphorism of Sangharakshita's. And we got loads and loads of attention, actually. People were really interested in this awareness is revolutionary, which I think it truly is. So, for the revolutionary, I think awareness is a truly important baseline. But metta, in a way, I think goes right to the heart of the issue. Loving kindness. I just could not believe the practice of metta when I first came across it. It was so extraordinary. And the thing that really, really got to me was the fourth stage. I'm kind of assuming that everybody here is familiar with the practices. So if I say anything that isn't familiar, there'll be time maybe at the end if you need to ask anything. But I really struggled. The fourth stage, I thought, why on earth would I put somebody in a meditation that I hate or that I don't like? What a weird idea. Why would you do that? It's like, life's hard enough without banging some nasty, horrible person and giving them mind space for 5-10 minutes or whatever. But when I had the practice explained to me and I realized that I wasn't being asked to suddenly like these people, but to go beyond like and dislike and actually have a solidarity and a respect for life, however that life was manifesting, I thought, oh my goodness. And I could see that this was a practice that could actually change the world. So I loved the metta bhavana straight away. Mindfulness, I'd struggled a bit more with, but metta I just I did think, yeah, that's what we need. And one of the things that happened when I started to meditate was I realized how much anger and kind of darkness really I had in myself, because I'd found a whole load of ways of not ever going anywhere near that pain or whatever in myself, whether it was being very busy and very active or whether it was doing a lot of drugs or whether it was, whatever. And when I meditated for whatever, 40 minutes or something, I just had to sit and be with myself, which was quite a struggle, quite a challenge. And I realized I had very little inner peace at all. That peace was not something that I experienced, or contentment or tranquility. Not at all. My first meditations, actually, I spent the whole time singing songs to myself because I'd sung for a while in a band. So I had all these country and western, I'm sorry, but I had a lot of country and western songs going around my head for weeks. In the Bodhicharyavatara, which is a work of Shantideva, it's a beautifully philosophic and poetic work. About meditation, he says, one's mind finds no peace, neither enjoys pleasure nor delight, nor goes to sleep, nor feels secure, while the dart of hatred is stuck in the heart. And the first time I read that, I thought, whoa, no sleep, no peace, while the dart of hatred is stuck in the heart. So this, for me, was it started me on quite a long journey that I'd say I still traverse, of looking at how to deal with anger and rage and those kind of, my negative states don't tend to be down the desire, or not that I don't do desire, but they don't tend to fall down that end of craving. They tend to go more to the aversion, kind of anger, irritation, frustration, grumpy kind of end of the spectrum. I like to think it's something to do with having a sharp mind, but I think that might be just an excuse. So I realised that before I could really practice as a Buddhist, and certainly before I could change anything externally, I needed to find a way of finding inner peace. So meditation, although I didn't find it easy, and I didn't really want to do it to begin with, has become a really crucial part of my path, my own sort of path. And I think as revolutionaries, we need inner stillness and inner quiet, because otherwise I think, well, burnout can happen, or we jump off and rush off and do things that seem good, but actually are not coming from a deep inner stillness. There's a lot I could say about that deep inner stillness, but I'd like to share a poem with you from Wendell Berry, which is a poem that some of you might know. I think it's called The Peace of Wild Things. So I'll just read that to you, and then I'll say a little bit about why I find it so important. Excuse me. When despair grows in me, and I wake in the night at the least sound, in fear of what my life and my children's lives may be, I go and lie down where the wood drake rests in his beauty on the water, and the great heron feeds. I come into the peace of wild things who do not tax their lives with forethought of grief. I come into the presence of still water, and I feel above me the day-blind stars waiting for their light. For a time I rest in the grace of the world, and I am free. So that poem and others, Wendell Berry's, I like his poetry, and that in particular speaks to me of the kind of inner peace and inner quietness that I've personally had to spend a lot of time cultivating. But I've also come to realise it's a gift, and that it really is the basis of anything else that I do. But stillness, I believe, is not enough. Inner peace is not enough. I don't think the point, for me anyway, the point of a Buddhist practice is not to feel better. It's not to, well, it's good if you do feel better, but that's not its purpose, I don't think. And it's certainly not the purpose for me of my Buddhist practice. There's another aphorism of Sangharakshita's, which is peace is a fire. And I love that, just that little statement. So awareness is revolutionary, peace is a fire. Peace is passionate, it's ardent, it burns. It's not just a kind of nothingness or a closing down from the world. For me, real peace is not just the absence of war or the absence of noise. It's a positive, it's full, it's a fullness. And I think it's there in how we relate to the world around us. So I guess the question then that comes up is, if I went to be a peaceful revolutionary, if we went to have a peaceful revolution, how do we stop hatred and violence? How do we actually work in a world where greed, hatred, and delusion, the three basic poisons of Buddhism, stalk the world, not only in individual forms or manners, but in corporate manner, institutionalized manner? You know, greed, hatred, and delusion is possibly bigger than ever. It's certainly global. And it's very hard sometimes to see how to kind of interact with that. Well, I think, and coming from the very long subtitle to the title of the talk, I think one of the things that's happening in the world, and has probably always happened, but seems to me at this point in time to be hugely problematic, is a very, very deep polarization. And you see it in the political sphere, you see it in, well, you see it in all sorts of spheres. And oh God, you know, if I had enough time, if this was a 3-week series or something, there's a whole lot you could say. I would say about my thoughts as to why that is, or my thoughts as to how media, you know, the corporate media really exacerbate that, the place that fear plays in it, etc., etc. But I'm not going to talk about that. What I do want to talk about is, how do we break through polarization in the sort of sense of thinking of us and them? And, you know, when I was young, when I was involved in a kind of more political background, I realised looking back that all my political stances were oppositional, that every stance I took was in opposition to something else. You know, gay rights were in opposition to, maybe not in opposition, but they were in contrast to heterosexual society. Left wing was in contrast or in opposition to right wing. You know, women's politics of a certain type was definitely, you know, was theoretically in contrast to the patriarchy, but actually often meant being against men. You know, things were in some ways oppositional. But I think today, the way politics and the way the world is, those divisions seem to get really, really entrenched. And they're fed, I think, that entrenchment is fed for all sorts of reasons. But the Dhammapada tells us that hatred never ceases through hatred in this world. Through love alone does it cease. This is the eternal law. And before that, the verses just before that are really interesting. We often only hear that verse, hatred is never ceased by hatred, only by love, which is, you know, crucial, but it's interesting to see what comes before that in the Dhammapada. He abused me, he beat me, he defeated me, he robbed me. In those who harbour such thoughts, hatred is not appeased. He abused me, he beat me, he defeated me, he robbed me. In those who do not harbour such thoughts, hatred is appeased. So what I take that as saying is that hatred arises when we make us and them, when we other, when we see ourselves, in this case, as victim, but not only as victim, but with a need to retaliate. So and this is not to say that there are not times when we need to stand up for ourselves, or times when we need to argue against the injustices that we see, but more like in our heart, if we can actually find a way through metta to keep our heart open. And even where we might criticise, for example, a political system, to not actually demonise those people that we see as holding that. And it's quite a trek. I mean, it's a big ask. But I think anything that helps us break through us and them thinking is part of this peaceful revolution. If you'll indulge me, I'd like to share a dream with you that I had way back in the day. So I had this dream, right? And in this dream, I was above Nicaragua. So this was in the period of the troubles in Nicaragua, where you had the Sandinistas and the Contras from the USA fighting. And in this dream, so it must have been whenever that was, in the 80s. I can't remember if I was ordained or if it was just after I was ordained, maybe. And in this dream, I had this task, which was to sing to the souls of the dying. So there I was above this battleground, and spirits were arising, and my task was to sing to them so that they could pass on to their next birth. I was very new to things. Anyway, this was a dream, right? But in this dream, what happened was the spirit would arise and I'd say, okay, hang on a minute, are you a Sandinista or a Contra? And if the answer was a Sandinista, I would sing to them. But if they were Contras, if they were from the USA, then I wouldn't sing to them. And I woke up, I felt devastated by this. When I woke up, I thought, oh my goodness, my metta practice goes nowhere. If I'm only able to offer solace to those who agree with me, I haven't actually sort of gone very far yet. So anyway, that gave me some pause for thought. And I think it did actually help me to see the importance of metta in attempting to function in a world that is very polarized. So I think that metta is the basic principle. Anyway, so moving on, that was all meditation. And I told Vanaraji this was going to happen. I've gone way off script, but never mind. I shall get back on script now. So that path of meditation is also a path of ethics. And that's really important. I think we can't have a peaceful revolution if we're not able to put ethics very much at the heart of it. Because I do believe that we create the world that we live in. I don't mean that in a necessarily existential sense or in a deeply philosophical sense. I mean, how we are affects everybody around us, and then it affects what comes back at us. So in quite a pragmatic way, I think we can create the world that we live in. And if we can practice the precepts in every bit of our life, then we create a world of contentment, of love, of generosity, of truthfulness, which I really think is so important at the moment. Really to know the truth of things and not to be taken in by fake truths. Kindness, harmony, all of those values which we as Buddhists take to be very important in our ethical practice. I think if I want to be a peaceful revolutionary, then those ethics need to be part of my toolkit in how I'm relating to the world around me. Otherwise, we do contribute to the problem rather than being part of the solution. And there's so many ways that I think we can think about doing that. I mean, I'm sure all of you can think of your own ways of how we can bring our Buddhist values into relationship with how we live our lives, what we eat, what we buy, where we buy from, how we speak to each other, how we speak to the people that we love most is often a little bit of a, it's so easy with the people that we're closest to let our speech just slip a wee bit. But speech creates a world. I do believe that speech as much as action creates the world that we live in. So we can create an ambience of kindness, non-conflict, of peace, through the terms that we use, through the words that we use, through the way we speak, not only to each other, but about each other and about others in the world, the kind of terminology. I mean, it's easy to be classed as being politically correct if we try to use language which is inclusive or which is non-harmful. But actually, I don't think there's anything up with being politically correct myself. I mean, I think if you're only doing it because you want to be politically correct, then maybe there's something to look at there. But actually, I think it's important that we are a bit careful about the language that we use, because it does create a world. It goes out into the world. And just a few wee things here that I think is worth thinking about. If we want to create a peaceful world around us, I think it's really important to learn how to apologise well. And I think the other side of that is to learn how to receive an apology and how to forgive ourselves and each other. Because I think if we can't do that, I mean, it's a horrible experience, which, you know, if you've ever had the experience of really feeling some regret about something and then going to somebody and trying to, you know, say that, but they're not able yet to hear you. And it's quite a, you know, it's quite hard when that happens. But I think if we do feel that, you know, there's something we've done or said, it is important to be willing to try and make amends. Because I think that allows for healing to happen, even if it can't happen immediately. I think if we can move towards each other in those kind of situations. So in a way, I'm talking about how to do that individually. How do we do that with each other? Whether it's each other in a community like this, or whether it's each other in a broader sense, the people we live with, the people we work with. Family can also sometimes be quite a trying kind of area for those of us that, I mean, maybe some of you here just been blessed with a loving and beautiful family that support you in every action and everything. I personally didn't come from quite that wonderful a background. And I often find that family is where it's hardest to be a new person, because they kind of know you as you were before, and it's not always easy for them either to kind of accept that you're changing or that you're transforming or that you're moving on. But I think that works in a bigger scale as well. So I think that, like, trying to create that kind of ambience of peace, I think it's quite important to try and do it wherever we can, not just in the small situations in our life, but wherever we see things like injustice, racism, homophobia, if it feels safe to do so, I think it's important to speak out against it. I think it's quite important to actually let people know that it's not all right. Some things are just not all right. But if we can do that from a heart full of metta, then I think actually that goes a long way to creating a better world. And of course, that can be quite daunting. You know, it can feel quite scary sometimes to do that, which is why I think it's quite important to have friends that, you know, support us in these sort of things. Community, I think, is incredibly important. When we try to fight, as it were, the powers of darkness or the powers of greed, hatred, and delusion, I mentioned earlier this idea of seeing them as institutionalized. I don't know if you've read David Loy, but he's very good on this subject, and I'd recommend his book. I can never quite remember the order, but it's Sex, War, Money, and something else. And he's very interesting in that he talks about how greed, hatred, and delusion have become institutionalized. And Shantideva in the Bodhicharyavatara, which I've already mentioned, says, oh, and this is one of these, like, you hear it and you go, oh, ding, light bulb moment. Virtue is perpetually ever so feeble, while the power of vice is great and extremely dreadful. If there were no spirit of perfect awakening, what other virtue could overcome this? So what I understand him to be saying in this, what Sangharakshita says about that in the seminar that he did on the Bodhicharyavatara, is you cannot fight evil, to use that term, on its own level. You can't because as soon as you try to do that, you just become on the same level. So we need something that lifts us above that. And he says it's the spirit of perfect awakening. And this spirit of perfect awakening is the bodhicitta. The bodhicitta, the heart, the mind of awakening, but not awakening for one's own sake, but awakening to create a better world, awakening so that others can also awake and see what is the way to work with dukkha and with suffering. So the bodhicitta is the heart of what's known as the bodhisattva ideal. And this is the overcoming of self and other, the breaking through that polarization where we over-identify with me and mine at the expense of them and theirs. And peace, a peaceful revolution can never happen while that identification is at the heart of our actions. So this Bodhisattva ideal is known as the great ideal of compassion, but it also has at its heart wisdom. And that wisdom is the other part of the threefold path, the meditation, the ethics, and wisdom. And it's wisdom that actually liberates us from this mistaken polarization of self and other, because wisdom is what helps us break through that false sense of self. Wisdom teaches us, the Buddha's wisdom teaches us that we make a mistake in how we think we exist. It's not that we don't exist. So I'm moving into the realms of Shunyata, which for some of you is probably very familiar. Maybe for some of you it's less familiar. It's often translated as emptiness. It more means it's empty of, it's not emptiness as a thing or a place or a great big black hole. It's empty of. And what it's saying is that all phenomena, including you and me, are empty of permanence. There is nothing within us that lasts forever. I mean, I'm sorry, but you'll see that as you get older. You know, your hair changes, you start looking like your mother or your father when you look in the mirror. You know, time passes, we know that nothing is permanent. But the Buddhist analysis is going a bit deeper than that. It's saying there is also no separateness, there is no independently arisen self. That everything, every atom, every part of our being, whether it's physical, emotional, mental, spiritual, arises in dependence upon conditions, comes together in dependence upon those conditions, and as those conditions change, then the phenomenon changes. So the Buddha was saying there is not only no thing that lasts forever, there is no thing that is independently existing. I'm sorry, this is like, you know, quite complex material I'm trying to cram into 2 minutes in a talk. And again, it's probably familiar to many of you, but the important thing within that is to understand that we don't live in harmony with that, and that is what causes suffering. We don't live in harmony with the fact that everything arises and everything passes. We try to cling to what makes us feel better. We push away what we think might challenge or what might threaten our sense of identity. So polarization often arises because we're defending that sense of self, either as an individual, so anything that might threaten that, you know, just, I'm going to make sure I keep it away. I might even attack it before it attacks me, just in a little preemptive strike. But it happens in bigger and bigger and bigger scales. So David Loy uses the term the we-go as well as the ego, which I actually quite like. So we identify not only with ourselves as an individual, but we start to identify with groups that are the same as. Whether that's, you know, in my case as a younger woman, where I would identify very strongly with my commie pals, or I would identify very strongly with a particular kind of grouping that I was part of, and that's what makes it in opposition in a sense. So what the peaceful revolution has to break that down, and it has to start in a way. The wisdom is starting, we're realizing in ourselves that we are not so separate. Wisdom is the realization that greed, hatred, and delusion arise from that false sense of self. And it's not static, it's dynamic, it's expansive, and it takes us beyond the smallness and narrowness of our own more self-centered, self-serving kind of ego. So true peace will only come through the understanding of the conditioned nature of existence. Not only the conditioned nature of me and of you, but the whole conditioned nature of all phenomena. And when we start to see that, we unpack the solidness of things and we unpack that identification. So it's important to know how to live in harmony with that. A peaceful revolution needs to be a revolution that has at its basis wisdom as well as compassion, and the realization that excuse me, the realization that we are not separate from other, and that realization, our compassion needs to take us to a place where we don't feel compassion only for those that we perceive as victim, but we're also able to see through a realization of the arising and the passing of conditions, that all phenomena is impermanent, doesn't have a substantial, unchanging heart to it. One of the things that I've found quite helpful in this comes from a completely different tradition, which is from the 12-step communities. And I think it comes from St. Francis of Assisi originally. But anyway, it's the serenity prayer. So grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. So I think our peaceful revolution needs wisdom, because we need to know, what can I do? What can I change? Otherwise, we spend our energy and our time in hopeless pursuits. But also, we need courage to change the things that we can change. Serenity to accept where we can't change. And that serenity is living in harmony with the reality of things. Anyway, I haven't yet told you about the two revolutionaries that I wanted to tell you about, but I'm going to do that now. So I want to tell you about Dr. Ambedkar. So I'm kind of going to work on the assumption that most of you will probably have come across Dr. Ambedkar. If you haven't, I really recommend anybody that's interested in a non-violent revolution would find Dr. Ambedkar's life. It's a masterclass in the peaceful revolution. So he was Indian. He was born into the untouchable caste, Dalit caste as it's sometimes known. And so by rights, he should never really have made anything much of himself, but partly through his determination and his intelligence, and also the good fortune that somebody was his patron and actually allowed him to have an education, he ended up becoming the first law minister of an independent India and helped to write the constitution. I mean, that is just extraordinary, really. And I do highly recommend that you explore his life a little bit if you haven't done before. But he converted to Buddhism. And just to say a little bit, he'd been thinking about the roots of the problems for his people, as it were. And he thought, well, the root of the problem is caste, the caste system in India. And he came to understand, and this is quite a major understanding, that caste, the roots of caste lie in the mind. It's mind made. It's kind of it's systemic, but it's, the laws that held it in place were mind made initially. And his big statement that he made was, caste is a notion, it's a state of mind. But what that made him realize was actually what mind creates, mind can change. So he set off on a journey to find how could you change the mind and hearts of people, which he saw as important, or even perhaps more important than changing the law. And I think you can see that. I mean, you can change the law, but if people's hearts and minds aren't changed, then they'll still act. They might not do certain very crude things because it's against the law, but unless they're really behind it, their heart and mind's behind something, unless our hearts and minds are behind something, it's very easy to go off the track. And it's very easy really to not uphold those values. So he decided in 1936, he said that he had been born a Hindu, but he would not die a Hindu. And he began to search for another religion. And he wanted to find something which would work not only for him, but for his people, for the people of the lower castes in India. And he had very definite criteria for what that religion should be. It needed to enshrine the principles of liberty, equality, and fraternity. However, it also needed to be compatible with reason and science. He didn't want anything that had blind belief in supernatural agency. And this was very important for him, it should not in any way justify poverty. So I quite like the fact that out of everything he explored, he came down apparently to two options, Marxism or Buddhism. So I quite like that. But anyway, he chose Buddhism, which is all for the good. So he'd been learning about the Buddha, and he'd been very drawn to that. And what he liked about Buddhism, well, the Dharma, was that it had spiritual power, but it also had an emphasis on social morality. And that was important for him. He didn't want a religion that was personal. He didn't want a religion that was just something you practiced in this, the confines of your own home. He wanted something that would actually have an effect on society. And he came to the conclusion that Buddhism, the Dharma, was the answer to that. So on the 14th of October, 1956, he took refuge in the Buddha, Dharma and Sangha. And the next day, he inducted more than 400,000 of his followers into Buddhism. It's the first mass conversion to Buddhism, and something that in Sri Ratna we do try and celebrate. So he was very sure that the Dharma could offer something, and he thought it was the most sure basis for a truly just society anywhere in the world. And I believe that too. I think it's really interesting to think of the Dharma as a basis for the creation of a new society. And that was one of the things that got me involved in the then FWBO, Friends of the Western Buddhist Order. I wanted to change society, and Sangharakshita, and again, this is why I thought of him as a revolutionary. He talked about the need to create a new society that had Buddhist values at its heart. And I just wanted to sign up for that as a project. And I still think that that's the project that I'm interested in. So, yeah, so one of the things that concerns me sometimes about Western Buddhism is I think it can become a bit overly inward looking. I think it can become a purely kind of religious entity or something. And of course, we need the contemplative, we need the meditative within that. If you'll indulge me for a wee, oh God, desvio, a wee sidetrack, that'll do, a wee sidetrack. When I was about 10 or 11, I went to be a Catholic nun. And I had two aunties who were nuns. My Auntie Teresa was a nun in a Benedictine monastery. So she was behind the grill. This was the 50s and 60s. So she lived in a convent, and we saw her at Easter and at Christmas. And I thought this was amazing. I was absolutely fascinated by this idea of the convent and these women who lived behind these bars, as it were. And she prayed. That was what she did. She sang the liturgy. She prayed for a better world. And I thought this was fabulous. She interceded to God. That was her belief, that she was not hidden away from, well, she was hidden away from the world, but her belief was that she did that to give herself to God so that he would actually alleviate the suffering in the world. I thought that was pretty cool. But my other auntie, Wilhelmina, was a missionary. So she was in a medical mission in Africa, and she used to come to my granny's where I grew up, and she'd tell us all these amazing stories about what was happening in Africa. And I thought, I want to be one of those kind of nuns. So I used to try to go to sleep at night. I'd be thinking, oh my God, what kind of nun would I like to be? Did I want to be contemplative or apostolic? Did I want to go out and save the world, or did I want to pray to save the world? Anyway, I got over it quite quickly when I decided I didn't want to be a nun at all. But when I came across Buddhism, I was quite pleased that I didn't have to make that choice. I didn't have to be a contemplative Buddhist or an activist Buddhist. But actually, I could embrace both of those things. And for me, that's what Buddhism gives me. And for me, it's important as a Buddhist practitioner, as a Dharma practitioner, maybe better than saying a Buddhist, as a practitioner of the Dharma, I want to look at the world through that filter. I want to analyse the issues and the problems that I see in the world from a dharmic perspective. And I want my response to it to come from a dharmic perspective. I don't always manage that, to be honest, but it's what I aspire to. Because I think a lot of the problems or issues that are facing the world, environmental issues, discrimination, poverty, racism, war, I don't think they're political problems or issues. I think they're moral issues. And as somebody with a practice of ethics, I feel for me, I want to respond to those issues as moral issues rather than as political issues. But it must come from a dharmic analysis, because the revolution to change the world, I believe, needs to be a revolution based on Dharma values. Now, I'm not suggesting from that we all go out and convert everybody that we know to Buddhism, which basically doesn't work. I've tried it. Don't bother. You know, when I first got involved in Buddhism, I wanted everybody that I knew to become Buddhists immediately. And I had very little success. In fact, I suspect there are people wandering around Glasgow that will never go anywhere near a Buddhist centre because of my zealot manner of attack, as it were. But I do think, why was I saying that? Yeah, I don't think we want to create a Buddhist world in a sense, but I think what I'd like to see us do is create a world which is influenced by Buddhist values through how we are in the world. So, and I think the world needs it at the moment. I really do. You know, there's a horrendous swing happening in the world, I think. You know, to put it in political terms, I would say it's a swing to the far right. I don't just mean right wing rather than left wing, or, you know, conservative rather than Labour. I mean a swing to the extreme right wing in places like Hungary, Poland. And, you know, who knows where it might end up. And things that my generation fought for, rights as it were, are being pulled back. I think it's quite scary. So I think the world really, really needs those kind of values of kindness and clarity and compassion and wisdom. And I've completely lost my place now. But yeah, for me, the only way really to try and combat those things is to try and influence, rather than to try and convert. It's to just exemplify or be an influence. We can be what the Buddha called a fourth sight for people. We can show that there is another way to live, that we don't need to get caught up in huge consumerism. We don't need to go bonkers at Christmas and spread COVID by rushing into, you know, department stores 10 minutes after it opens and, you know, whatever. So a world that can be affected by Buddhist values, I think, is very, very important. And we're coming to the end of 2020. What a year. I mean, you know, who would have thunk it? March, you know, it feels like we're still in March. There was a little blip of the summer where you could maybe do some things, but, you know, I don't know where all of you live. I don't know what tier you're all in. I'm in Glasgow, which is level 3. I can't, you know, the whole of Scotland, except the Orkney and Shetland, you can't go into anybody else's home at the moment. You know, like life is just not normal. And frankly, I really don't want it to go back to the normal that it was before. I think it's wonderful that there's a vaccine. It's fantastic, wonderful work that's been done to do that. But I really don't want us just to go back to business as usual, because business as usual was frankly pretty rubbish in a lot of ways. I mean, it's all right for me. I've got a great life. I'm quite privileged, you know, I've got a nice warm flat, got enough to eat. I'm not worried about paying my rent. I might not have an excessive amount beyond that, but I have everything I need. But I know that there are so many others in the world that don't. And it's rubbish to say that COVID has affected everybody the same. Of course, it hasn't affected everybody the same. The virus is the same virus. But if you're living in a rural slum in India, the virus is not affecting you the same way as it's affecting me in my nice 11th floor cozy warm flat in Glasgow. It's nonsensical to think it is. And I really, really want us to take this pause as an opportunity to see, how can we be more resilient? How can we be more equitable in the world that we build from this? Dr. Ambedkar, when he talked about the peaceful revolution, he said, educate, agitate, and organise. So I'd like to ask you, just to consider, if you're interested in being part of the peaceful revolution, educate yourself on what that might look like, which means just as much as anything, educating yourself on who you are. What's your conditioning? What are your triggers? What is it that you find easy? What do you find difficult? How can you contribute in ways that are helpful to you as well as to others? Agitate, be willing to kind of stick your nose out sometimes, put your head above the parapet, all those different phrases. But don't do it in a way that makes you unsafe. Do it in a way that's safe, but do it with each other. I don't mean agitate each other, I mean agitate together, because I think there is power in numbers. I think the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. I still believe that. And organise, find ways to actually come together, because the peaceful revolution can only happen if peaceful revolutionaries get together and make it happen. So there you go. That's been very long. I will just finish with two other little quotes. One of them is from Che Guevara, who was a revolutionary that I had some admiration for, although also some criticisms. Anyway, he says, at the risk of seeming ridiculous, let me say that the true revolutionary is guided by a great feeling of love. It is impossible to think of a genuine revolutionary lacking this quality. So I think the Bodhisattva is the revolutionary. The Bodhisattva ideal is pointing to the peaceful revolution. In a talk in 1983, Sangharakshita gave a talk called Buddhism, World Peace and Nuclear War, which was one of those seminal talks of Sangharakshita's. There's a number of them which every time I felt like jacking in the FWBO, he'd give a talk and I think, oh, all right, I'll stay. And this was one of those talks. And he talks about peace and he says, in order to really achieve world peace, we shall have to deepen our realization of the indivisibility of humanity. We shall have to identify ourselves more closely with all living beings and love them with a more ardent and selfless love. We shall have to be a louder and clearer voice of sanity and compassion in the world. So that for me is the definition of the peaceful revolution. And that's where I want to go as a revolutionary. Thank you. And I apologise for that being so long. I tend to get a bit carried away.